If you're anything like me, you will hate missing photos. You see an incredible opportunity pop up while you're out and about to take a great image, but then you spend way too long messing around with your camera settings, making sure everything is correct, that you end up missing the photo, and then you spend the rest of the day thinking about that one image and what it could have been. We've all been there, we've all done it. But there are actually a few different ways in which you can actually try and minimize that happening while you are out and about on a photo shoot or a photo walk. So what I thought I would do is go through a few ways in which I've set up my LUMIX S9 to give me as much opportunity as I possibly can to never miss a shot, and make sure you stick around to the end of the video for a little bonus tip as well. So the very first thing I do is I put my camera into aperture priority mode, and this is one of the main modes I will use for all of my photography unless I want to do something more specific where I need full control, and then I will go over into manual mode. For 80%, maybe even 90% of my stuff, I just use aperture priority mode. But we are going to go in and dial in just a little bit further so that you do have a little bit more control over what your camera is doing in aperture priority mode. So once you've popped your camera into aperture priority mode, you're going to want to go into the menu and scroll all the way down to minimum shutter speed. Now what you choose here might vary depending on what it is that you are shooting. For me, most of the time I leave it at 1/25th of a second, but you might want something a little bit slower or a little bit faster. For me, 1/25th of a second means that I can shoot very comfortably handheld, and it means that most subjects in my image, if they're walking, will be completely frozen without any motion blur. Again, if you need something a little bit faster, or you're happy shooting at a slower shutter speed because you want a little bit more light coming into your camera, go ahead, choose whichever one works for you. Then we're going to go back into the menu and we're going to scroll up to ISO sensitivity photo, which is on the first page of the image quality menu. And this is where you can choose a range that your ISO will flick between, so when it is automatically exposing your images. And you always typically want to keep your ISO as low as you possibly can for the cleanest, noise-free images. But sensors are that good now that you can boost the ISO fairly high and still get some really good results. So much so that I am more than happy shooting at ISO 6400, sometimes maybe even 8000. But just to be safe, I will typically set my ISO upper limit to 6400, so it will never go above that, and my ISO lower limit to 100. And by doing that, the camera is always going to keep it as low as it possibly can without going over 6400, so I know that I'm always going to get a clean image. So now that we've got that set up, whenever you go to take photos, your camera is going to work out the correct shutter speed and ISO to create a nicely balanced exposure for your image, while the only thing that you need to worry about is your aperture, which you can use to let more or less light in and control your depth of field, which you can do with the front dial as normal, or if you have a lens like I'm using right now, the Sigma 45mm f2.8, this lens has an aperture dial on the front of it, which means I can control the aperture with the dial. The next thing to do is to select the right metering mode. Now the metering mode is what will affect how the camera reads the exposure, and then in turn that will affect your shutter speed and your ISO, because they are effectively in auto even though they're still working between a range for each one. But there are 4 different metering modes to choose from. So this top option measures the brightness of the whole screen. You can meter for the center of the image. One that I tend to use quite a lot is the spot metering mode, because you can move the little box around and then it will read the exposure for wherever that little box is in your frame. But the one that I tend to use most of the time is the bottom one, where it exposes for the highlights. And the reason I do this is because when it comes to editing later on, it is much easier to bring back the shadows than it is to recover the highlights in a photo. It's almost the opposite to video. Video, you're typically trying to overexpose your log video footage. Photos, I am much happier underexposing my images because I know there is plenty of data to be able to bring that back later on. So I would typically flick between these bottom 2 metering modes. The spot metering one does give you a little bit more flexibility, because sometimes if it is a very contrasty scene, maybe the sky is really bright and it's exposing for the sky, it can be quite difficult to frame your image with everything else being almost black. By using the spot metering mode, you can then slide the box into the shadows so that you can see your image easier, and then you can go and expose for the highlights, which just It can help with framing your image, but sometimes it can slow you down a little bit, which is why I would then go to use the bottom metering mode. When you're using the LUMIX S9, it is a little bit different to shooting with the S5 II, and the main reason for me is because it hasn't got the little joystick on the back of the camera, which is something that I use all of the time on the S5 II because it is so quick and easy to just move the focus points around and things like that. On the S9, obviously you've got the touch screen, so you can tap to focus if you want to, but what you can also do is tap left and then down on the D-pad, and then use that same D-pad with the up, down, left, right buttons to move around that autofocus box. And you can change the size of it using the dial on the top as well, which can just give you a little bit of extra control if you want it. It's not perfect, it's a nice feature to have. I do wish there was a little joystick in the top corner. Maybe we'll get that on the Mark II. The final thing to do is to make sure that you are using the correct autofocus settings. So if you go into the autofocus menu, we've obviously got tracking, full area, and then all of the different zone detection modes. But if you go into each of these different ones, I tend to use the full area autofocus on the S9. It's a little bit different on the S5 II, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. But if I go into the detecting subject, you can obviously choose between human, animal, car, motorcycle, and all of these different things. And with the latest firmware, these all work absolutely brilliantly. But what you can then do is you can go and customize all of these different autofocus settings even further. So if we go into the menu, select AF Custom Setting Photo, and you can see that we get 4 different options, and these are effectively different autofocus presets which determine how quick and snappy the autofocus is, and you get full control over it. So with these different sets, you can then go in and customize each one as much as you want to, and then save them so that you have your own autofocus presets, so that you can set them up for different things that you want to shoot. Maybe it's sports, wildlife, you name it, you get full control over it. It's super useful, and you can just get it set up in exactly the way that suits you and your photography. And that's it when it comes to getting your S9 set up to go out and hopefully never miss a shot with your LUMIX S9. The only thing that is going to stop you from missing a shot now is you. So no pressure. I did mention that I had a bonus tip as well. What's that? And that is this. This is a Peak Design capture clip. You've probably seen one of these, but this is the most useful thing I have ever found when it comes to not missing a photo. Because how many times have we all missed photos because our camera has been in our bag, and by the time we've got it out, like I said earlier in the video, that opportunity has then gone and you've missed that photo. With the capture clip, it means that your camera is always accessible because it is on your shoulder all of the time. It's not stuck in your bag, which means that you can quickly grab it and get the image. And when you combine that with the settings that we've just set up, the chances of missing your photo is a lot smaller. So definitely go out and get yourself one of these if you haven't got one. I did genuinely think it was a bit of a gimmick when I first got it, but having used it, I've had it for a couple of years now, having used it, I realised very quickly that it was very useful, and it became one of my favourite photography accessories I've ever used. I will drop a link down in the description down below if you want to go and check it out. There are other options out there as well. I think Ulanzi do a fairly popular one, but this is the Peak Design one. I think it's great. So that's it for this video. Go out and enjoy shooting with your LUMIX S9 and hopefully don't miss any shots. If you don't have an S9, these settings are exactly the same on the S5 II and things like that, and pretty much exactly the same across all camera brands. It doesn't just have to be LUMIX that you set it up like this. The menus will be slightly different, but they all work the same. So yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Enjoy shooting. See you in the next one.